February 17th, 1943, the Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. First light breaks across the desert floor, painting the rocky hills in shades of copper and gold. American infantrymen from the 1st Armored Division crouch in shallow foxholes scraped from the hard North African earth, their breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn cold. They can hear engines in the distance, the low rumble of armor on the move. Some of them have been in country for less than 2 weeks. Most have never seen real combat. They grip their M1 Garands with white knuckles, waiting for orders that will send them forward across open ground toward German positions dug into the ridgeline above. Then, without warning, the world splits open. A sound like the tearing of fabric, magnified 1,000 times, rips through the morning air. Before the crack fully registers in their minds, the ground erupts 20 yards to their left. Dirt, rock, and shrapnel explode upward in a column of violence. Men are thrown sideways. Others simply disappear into the smoke. And then it comes again and again. The survivors don't think. They don't look for the source. They dive. They claw at the earth. They press themselves into depressions that weren't there seconds before, willing their bodies to become part of the landscape. Because somewhere out there, hidden in the hills, invisible and impossibly accurate, is a weapon that will define their understanding of fear for the rest of their lives. The German 88mm gun has just announced itself to the American Army. The story of the 88 begins not on the battlefields of North Africa, but in the shadow of the Versailles Treaty. When Germany surrendered in 1918, the victorious Allied powers imposed severe restrictions on German military development. The treaty limited the types and numbers of weapons the defeated nation could produce. But restrictions, as history repeatedly shows, breed innovation. German engineers, forbidden from developing certain categories of weapons, found creative ways to interpret the rules. In the early 1930s, as the Nazi regime openly began rearming Germany in defiance of Versailles, the Krupp Armaments Company received a contract to design a new anti-aircraft gun. The result was the Flak 18, where Flak stood for Fliegerabwehrkanone, or aircraft defense cannon. The designation 88mm referred to the caliber of the barrel, the internal diameter through which the shell would travel. On paper, it was an air defense weapon designed to knock bombers from the sky at high altitude. In practice, it would become something far more deadly. The genius of the 88 lay in its engineering. The gun featured an exceptionally long barrel, nearly 17 feet from breech to muzzle. This length allowed the propellant gases to accelerate the projectile to extraordinary velocities. When fired, an 88mm shell left the barrel at roughly 2,700 feet per second. For comparison, most contemporary artillery pieces fired shells at speeds between 1,000 and 1,500 feet per second. This high velocity gave the 88 two critical advantages. First, its shells flew on flat trajectories, meaning they didn't arc high into the air like traditional artillery, but instead screamed toward their targets in nearly straight lines. This made aiming simpler and more accurate. Second, the kinetic energy imparted by that velocity gave the shells tremendous penetrating power. What began as an anti-aircraft weapon quickly revealed itself as a tank killer of unprecedented effectiveness. The Spanish Civil War, that brutal proving ground for Nazi military doctrine, provided the first hints of the 88's potential against ground targets. German advisors supporting Franco's nationalist forces discovered that when aimed horizontally, rather than skyward, the anti-aircraft gun could punch through enemy fortifications with devastating effect. The lesson was not lost on Wehrmacht planners. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, doctrine had already begun to evolve. The 88 would serve dual purpose. It would defend against aircraft, yes, but it would also be deployed as a direct-fire anti-tank weapon. The Polish campaign provided limited opportunity to test this theory. France, however, would prove it beyond doubt. May 1940, the German blitzkrieg crashes through the Ardennes forest and explodes into France. French and British armor, including heavily armored Matilda and Char B-1 tanks, mount desperate counterattacks against the German advance. Standard German anti-tank guns, the 37mm and 50mm weapons carried by infantry divisions, prove inadequate against the thick armor of these vehicles. Frantic radio calls go out for help. 88mm batteries, originally positioned to defend against Allied aircraft, are rapidly repositioned. Crews lower the barrels from their anti-aircraft angle to horizontal. Rangefinders calculate distance. Loaders slam shells into breaches. Then the firing begins. The results stun both sides. French Char B-1 tanks, with frontal armor up to 60 millimeters thick, are stopped dead at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Armor plate that had shrugged off conventional anti-tank rounds tears open like paper under the impact of 88mm shells. British Matildas, previously considered nearly invulnerable to German fire, burn on the battlefield. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, personally observes the effect and immediately requests more 88mm guns for his division. The reputation is born. Within weeks, Allied tank crews begin reporting encounters with a mysterious German supergun that could kill from impossible distances. But the true terror of the 88 would not fully manifest until it faced American forces in North Africa. When Operation Torch launched in November 1942, putting American troops ashore in Morocco and Algeria, the U.S. Army was largely untested. Most soldiers had trained stateside but had never experienced combat. Their equipment was new, their doctrine untried, their commanders learning on the job. Opposing them were German and Italian forces under Rommel's Afrika Korps, veterans of 2 years of desert warfare. The Germans had by this point fully integrated the 88 into their defensive doctrine. The gun came in several variants now. The Flak 36 and Flak 37 featured improved mobility and faster traverse, but all shared the same fundamental characteristics: high velocity, flat trajectory, and the ability to destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. The Americans were about to receive their education. Kasserine Pass stands as the bloodiest lesson. In mid-February 1943, German forces under General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim launched a powerful counterattack against overextended American positions in central Tunisia. The attack aimed to drive through the pass and into the Allied rear areas, potentially rolling up the entire American front. U.S. forces, spread thin and poorly coordinated, attempted to hold defensive positions in the rocky hills surrounding the pass. German battle groups, combining tanks, infantry, and crucially, 88mm guns, struck with overwhelming force. American accounts from the battle describe scenes of chaos and slaughter. German forces would advance with their 88s positioned on high ground or concealed in defiles. When American tanks or infantry attempted to maneuver, the 88s opened fire. The first indication of their presence was often the explosion. There was no muzzle flash visible at long range during daylight. There was no tracer to follow back to the source. There was just the sudden, catastrophic detonation of the shell, and then if you survived, the desperate scramble to find cover that didn't exist on the rocky desert floor. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Hightower of the 1st Armored Regiment later wrote in his after-action report that his battalion lost 11 tanks in less than an hour, then 20 minutes to unseen fire. The Sherman tanks his unit operated could not identify the source of the incoming rounds. When they tried to advance to close the range, more tanks were hit. When they tried to retreat, German armor pursued. The 88 batteries remained hidden, firing methodically, killing with impunity. Infantry support elements attempting to move forward on foot found themselves equally vulnerable. High-explosive 88mm shells, designed to detonate aircraft in midair, produced devastating fragmentation patterns when used against ground targets. A single round exploding near an infantry squad could kill or wound every man in the group. Survivors reported that the psychological effect was worse than the physical casualties. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no way to fight back against an enemy you couldn't see. The Germans had turned the 88 into more than a weapon. They had made it a component of combined arms warfare that rendered conventional Allied advantages meaningless. American artillery could match German guns in range and destructive power, but artillery required observation to aim. The 88s operated as direct-fire weapons with optical sights, engaging targets the crews could see themselves. American air superiority meant little when the guns were camouflaged or dug into reverse slope positions invisible from above, and American tank numbers, while growing, counted for nothing when each 88 could destroy 3, 4, 5 tanks before needing to displace. At Kasserine, the Americans suffered over 6,000 casualties, lost hundreds of vehicles, and learned in blood what the British had already discovered. The 88 demanded respect and tactical innovation, or it would kill you. The lessons from North Africa traveled with the American Army as it prepared for the invasion of Sicily and then Italy. Officers who had survived Tunisia drilled their men on immediate action drills. If you hear the crack of an 88, you go to ground instantly, not a second later. Not after you look around, immediately. Because the time between the gun firing and the shell arriving at your position could be measured in single-digit seconds. At 1,000 yards, roughly half a mile, an 88mm shell traveling at 2,700 feet per second arrives in approximately 1.8 seconds. Add human reaction time, add the time needed to actually move your body into cover, and you have perhaps 3 to 5 seconds total. At 1,500 yards, you might have 9 or 10 seconds, but that assumed you recognized the sound immediately. It assumed you didn't freeze. It assumed there was cover available within diving distance. Veterans quickly learned to read terrain differently. They looked for depressions, ditches, stone walls, anything that could stop or deflect an 88mm shell. They learned to move in short rushes, never crossing open ground at a steady pace that would allow a German gunner to track them. They learned that surviving an 88 barrage was as much about luck as skill, but that luck favored the man who hit the dirt the instant he heard that distinctive crack. Sicily, July 1943. American and British forces storm ashore in Operation Husky, the invasion of the Italian island. German defensive positions, particularly around the key port of Gela, include carefully sighted 88mm guns covering the beaches and approach roads. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, though understrength and hastily organized, mounts a fierce counterattack on the invasion beaches. American infantry, pushing inland from the landing zones, suddenly find themselves under direct fire from 88s positioned in the hills overlooking the coastal plain. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers attempts to suppress the German guns, but the 88s are dug into concrete emplacements protected by earth and stone. They fire, displace to alternate positions, and fire again. American casualties mount. Units become pinned down. The advance stalls until concentrated artillery and airstrikes finally silence the guns one by one. The pattern repeats across Sicily and then, more brutally, up the length of the Italian peninsula. At Salerno, at Monte Cassino, along the Winter Line, and then the Gothic Line, American infantry learned to hate the sound of the 88. German doctrine calls for defense in depth. Rather than holding a single line, German forces established multiple defensive belts, each anchored by strong points. The 88s are key components of these strong points. A typical German defensive position might include 2 or 3 88mm guns sighted to provide overlapping fields of fire across approaches the Americans must use. The guns are dug in, sometimes in concrete bunkers, sometimes in simple earth revetments that make them nearly invisible. Infantry and machine gun positions protect the guns from close assault. Minefields channel attackers into kill zones. When American forces advance, they walk into a carefully prepared death trap. The 88s wait until the attackers are committed, fully in the open, and then fire. The high explosive shells airburst above infantry positions or slam directly into vehicles. Within seconds, an entire American company can be shattered, its survivors pinned down, unable to move forward or back. Sergeant James Cook of the 34th Infantry Division described one such engagement near Cassino in early 1944. His platoon had been tasked with clearing a German strongpoint on a hillside overlooking Highway 6. Intelligence reported the position was lightly held. The platoon moved forward in a skirmish line through an olive grove. They had advanced perhaps 200 yards when the first shell hit. Cook didn't hear the gunfire. He heard the explosion, saw 3 men simply vanish in a cloud of dirt and steel, and then he was on his face behind a low stone wall before his conscious mind caught up with his instincts. More shells followed. The platoon scattered, men diving behind trees, into irrigation ditches, anywhere that offered even the illusion of protection. For 20 minutes, the shelling continued. Every time someone moved, another round came in. Eventually, smoke grenades allowed the survivors to withdraw. Of 38 men who had started the attack, 14 were dead or wounded. They had never even seen the enemy. The 88 had done all the killing from a position over 1,000 yards away, and when American artillery finally ranged in on the suspected location, the German gun had already displaced. This was the reality of fighting in Italy. The terrain favored the defender. The Germans used every hill, every valley, every river crossing as a defensive position, and the 88 was the anchor of that defense. American infantry developed a dark joke. The only way to take out an 88 was with artillery or airstrikes. And by the time you called in the coordinates, the gun was gone. There was truth in the humor. German crews were trained to fire rapidly from prepared positions and then move. The guns could be disassembled and relocated relatively quickly. By the time American counter-battery fire arrived, the 88 would be in an alternate position, ready to fire again. This mobility, combined with the gun's lethality, made it the most feared weapon on the Italian front. Tank crews feared it. Infantry feared it. Even in protected positions, soldiers knew that an 88 could fire through most cover short of solid concrete. Then came Normandy, June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion of France brings the largest amphibious assault in history. American forces land on Omaha and Utah beaches. British and Canadian forces take Gold, Juno, and Sword. The initial landings are costly but successful. Now comes the breakout, pushing inland through the bocage country of Normandy, that dense patchwork of small fields bounded by ancient hedgerows. The terrain is a defender's paradise. Every field is a potential killing ground. Every hedgerow conceals a potential ambush, and the Germans, having had 4 years to prepare, have positioned their defenses with meticulous care. The 88mm gun, by now upgraded in some units to the even more powerful PaK 43 variant, with improved armor penetration, is everywhere. German doctrine calls for these guns to be positioned in depth, covering roads and obvious avenues of approach. American forces attempting to advance find themselves under fire from positions they cannot identify until it's too late. The hedgerows make the problem worse. In North Africa and Italy, at least you could sometimes see the terrain, identify likely positions for enemy guns. Call in artillery prep fires before you moved. In Normandy, visibility is measured in yards. An 88 can be positioned behind a hedgerow 200 feet away, completely invisible, and fire through gaps or over the top of the vegetation. American tanks attempting to break through find themselves silhouetted against the sky as they climb over hedgerows, perfect targets for waiting German gunners. Infantry attempting to advance on foot must cross open fields where any movement draws immediate fire. The 9-second rule becomes gospel. When you hear the crack of an 88, you have perhaps 9 seconds, if you're lucky, more like 5 or 6 in reality, to get your body below ground level before the next round arrives. And in the Normandy bocage, with its soft earth and drainage ditches, going to ground means pressing yourself into mud and praying. Corporal Eddie Grant of the 29th Infantry Division survived 3 separate engagements with 88 batteries in the 2 weeks following D-Day. In a letter written home months later, he tried to explain what it felt like to be under fire from the gun. He wrote that you never saw it coming. The first you knew was when the world exploded near you. Then you had a choice that wasn't really a choice. You could freeze and die, or you could move and maybe die. Or you could go flat and probably survive. He wrote that after the first few times it became instinct. Your body learned to interpret the sound, the crack in the air that meant high-velocity shell, and you were moving before your mind processed the information. He wrote that the worst part wasn't the fear, though there was plenty of that. The worst part was the helplessness. You couldn't shoot back. You couldn't maneuver. You couldn't do anything but endure and hope. And when the firing stopped and you raised your head and looked around, there were always men who hadn't been fast enough, who had hesitated a second too long, and they were gone. The armored units faced their own nightmare. The Sherman tank, the primary American medium tank throughout the war, was mechanically reliable, easy to produce, and available in enormous numbers. What it was not was well protected against 88mm fire. German testing after the war revealed that an 88mm anti-tank round could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Sherman's own 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of German Tiger or Panther tanks at any range. This disparity created a tactical problem with no good solution. American armor doctrine relied on maneuver in numbers. The idea was that while German tanks might be individually superior, American Shermans would overwhelm them through superior numbers and mobility. But the 88 upset this calculus. A single well-positioned gun could destroy multiple Shermans before they even got into effective firing range. And unlike tanks, the 88 could be dug into prepared positions that were nearly impossible to spot and extremely difficult to destroy. The solution, such as it was, came from combined arms integration. American forces learned that infantry, armor, artillery, and air support had to work in concert to neutralize 88 positions. The process was methodical and costly. First, reconnaissance elements, often infantry scouts, would attempt to identify likely positions for German anti-tank guns by observing terrain and enemy activity. Then artillery would plaster suspected positions with high explosive and smoke rounds, attempting to suppress or destroy the guns and obscure them from view. Under cover of this barrage, tanks would advance, but not in a straight line toward the suspected enemy position. Instead, they would maneuver to approach from angles that made them more difficult targets. Meanwhile, infantry would work forward on foot, using whatever cover the terrain provided, attempting to get close enough to engage the gun crews with small arms or grenades. If the infantry could reach the 88 position, they could kill or capture the crew and knock out the gun. But getting there required crossing open ground under fire, and the casualty rates for these assaults were horrific. Air support helped when weather permitted. Fighter bombers could attack suspected 88 positions with bombs and rockets. Though the guns were small targets, often well camouflaged, and pilots struggled to locate them even when ground units provided coordinates. The Germans became expert at using decoys, placing dummy guns in obvious positions to draw fire, while the real weapons remained hidden. They also learned to keep their guns silent until the last possible moment. Rather than firing at the first target of opportunity, disciplined German crews would wait until multiple American tanks or a formed body of infantry was in their kill zone, then open fire simultaneously. This maximized casualties and created chaos among the attackers. By the time American forces could respond, the Germans had often already displaced or were protected behind such formidable cover that counter-battery fire proved ineffective. The battles in Normandy dragged into July and August. American forces slowly, bloodily pushed forward. Every village was contested. Every field was a battlefield. And always the 88 was there. At Saint-Lô, at Carentan, in the fighting around Caen, the gun continued its grim work. American casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. Among infantry units, there was a bitter acknowledgement that survival was often more about luck than skill. You could do everything right, move tactically, use cover, maintain dispersion, and still the 88 could find you. The shell didn't care how well trained you were. It didn't care if you were a veteran of Sicily and Italy or a replacement fresh from the States. When the 88 fired, people died. The only question was whether you would be among them. And yet, American forces learned. Junior officers and NCOS, the ones who survived, developed instincts. They learned to read terrain the way German defenders did, identifying where they would place anti-tank guns if they were defending a position. They learned to call for artillery first and maneuver second. They learned that patience, as frustrating as it was, saved lives. Rather than rushing forward into obvious kill zones, successful commanders would take time to suppress and isolate enemy positions. They would use smoke liberally, not just for concealment, but to blind German gunners. They would coordinate with tank units to provide covering fire while infantry advanced. Slowly, painfully, the American army became more effective at dealing with the 88, but the gun never stopped being deadly. By the time American forces broke out from Normandy in late July and began their sweep across France, the nature of combat had shifted. The Germans were now in retreat, attempting to conduct fighting withdrawals while Allied forces pursued. But even in retreat, the 88 remained lethal. German doctrine for withdrawal called for rearguard actions at every defensible position. These rear guards almost always included at least one 88mm gun. The gun would be positioned to cover the retreat route, and when American forces appeared, the crew would engage long enough to inflict casualties and slow the pursuit, then displace before being overrun. This pattern repeated across France, through Belgium, and into Germany itself. Every river crossing, every town, every crossroads became a small battle where the 88 extracted its price in American lives. The statistics tell a story of their own. German forces deployed thousands of 88mm guns in various configurations throughout the war. Exact numbers are difficult to determine because production records were disrupted by Allied bombing and the chaos of Germany's collapse. But estimates suggest somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 guns of all variants were produced. These guns destroyed thousands of Allied tanks and killed tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. After-action reports from American armored divisions indicate that the 88 accounted for roughly 60% of all Sherman tank losses in Europe. Infantry units reported that high-velocity anti-tank guns, the 88 being the most common, were responsible for approximately 40% of casualties in certain engagements. These numbers represent more than statistics. Each number is a man who heard that crack in the air and didn't react quite fast enough. Each number is a tank crew that saw the flash of impact and then nothing. Each number is a family back home receiving a telegram that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." The German crews who operated these guns were not supermen. They were soldiers, often quite young, sometimes well-trained veterans, but just as often hastily schooled replacements trying to learn their trade under fire. They feared Allied artillery and air power. They knew that every time they fired, they revealed their position and invited retaliation. Gun crews suffered high casualty rates, particularly in the later stages of the war, when Allied material superiority became overwhelming. But they also took pride in their weapon. The 88 was, by any measure, one of the finest artillery pieces of the war. It was accurate, reliable, and devastating. German gunners knew that when they fired, they would likely hit what they aimed at, and what they hit would likely die. That knowledge gave them confidence, even when the tactical situation was desperate. American soldiers, for their part, developed a complex relationship with the weapon. They feared it, certainly. They respected it. And in a strange way, they understood it. The 88 was not like a bombing raid, impersonal and random. It was not like machine gun fire, where you might get lucky and stay below the arc of bullets. The 88 was direct, deliberate, and personal. A gunner aimed at you specifically and pulled the trigger. If he aimed well, you died. If he aimed poorly or you moved quickly enough, you lived. There was a clarity to that which, in the moral chaos of war, soldiers found almost comprehensible. The gun was an enemy you could understand even if you couldn't defeat it easily. It operated by rules, physics, geometry, the mathematics of trajectory and impact. And if you understood those rules and reacted quickly enough, you could survive. The 9-second rule, though not an official military doctrine, captured this understanding. It was informal wisdom passed from veteran to replacement, from sergeant to private, from tank commander to driver. When the 88 fires, you have 9 seconds at best, usually less, to save your life. 9 seconds to assess, decide, and act. 9 seconds between the crack in the air and the explosion that kills or maims. 9 seconds during which your training, your instincts, and your luck all collide to determine whether you see tomorrow. For the men who fought through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and Germany, those 9 seconds defined entire lifetimes. The soldiers who survived carried the knowledge forever. In war, the difference between life and death can be measured in heartbeats, and sometimes all you can do is hit the ground and pray. After the war ended, military analysts studied the 88 extensively. Engineers examined captured guns, measuring their precision and durability. Tacticians reviewed combat records, trying to understand how the weapon had been employed so effectively. The conclusions were sobering. The 88 succeeded not because of any single extraordinary characteristic, but because it combined several very good characteristics in one package: high velocity, flat trajectory, excellent accuracy, reasonable mobility, and the ability to engage multiple target types. It was a weapon that exploited the fundamental vulnerabilities of Allied armor and tactics. And because it was produced in large numbers and integrated thoroughly into German defensive doctrine, it had strategic impact far beyond its individual lethality. The 88 shaped how American forces fought in Europe. It forced tactical innovations, drove equipment development, and inflicted psychological trauma that lasted long after the guns fell silent. Veterans who returned home rarely spoke about the 88 specifically. They talked around it, mentioning the sound, the shock, the chaos. But the detailed memories, the feeling of pressing yourself into dirt that wouldn't quite swallow you whole, the sight of a tank exploding beside you, the realization that a friend you'd been talking to seconds before was simply gone, those memories stayed locked away, too raw to share with people who hadn't been there. In veterans' hospitals and late-night conversations among men who had served, the 88 came up. Someone would mention they'd been at Kasserine, or in the Bocage, or crossing the Rhine, and others would nod. They knew. They'd heard that crack. They'd felt that momentary suspension between sound and impact when your life hung on how fast you could move. And they'd survived, which meant they carried forward the memory of those who hadn't. The German 88mm gun represents one of those historical artifacts that transcends its physical form to become a symbol. To Allied soldiers who fought in Europe, it symbolized German military effectiveness, the technical competence and tactical skill that made Germany such a formidable opponent even when facing overwhelming numerical and material superiority. To military historians, it represents the importance of weapons design and tactical integration. The 88 was not a wonder weapon. It did not change the war's outcome, but it was extraordinarily effective at its intended purpose, and that effectiveness forced its opponents to adapt and innovate. To the generation of Americans who fought World War II, the 88 was simply the thing that tried hardest to kill them. They learned its signature sound. They learned where it would likely be positioned. They learned to move when it fired and to pray when they couldn't move fast enough. And the lucky ones, the survivors, learned that war is measured not in grand strategies or sweeping campaigns, but in individual moments of terror and survival in the 9 seconds between the crack in the air and the explosion that follows. In the instant when your training and luck and the quality of the dirt you're diving into all determine whether you live to remember the moment or become another casualty statistic in someone else's after-action report. Today, examples of the 88mm gun sit in museums across the world. They stand silent, deactivated, behind velvet ropes or glass cases. Visitors walk past them, reading plaques that describe the gun's technical specifications and historical significance. Few pause long enough to imagine what it meant to face this weapon in combat. Few consider the human dimension, the soldiers on both sides, the German crews who loaded and fired these guns under impossible conditions, knowing that counter-battery fire would eventually find them, and the American infantrymen and tank crews who advanced, knowing that somewhere ahead, concealed and waiting, an 88mm gun might be tracking them already. The metal is cold now, the mechanisms frozen, the barrels empty. But for those who heard them fire, for those who survived that distinctive crack and the seconds of desperate motion that followed, the 88 remains forever live, forever lethal, forever the thing that taught them exactly how much 9 seconds could mean when your life depended on them.